Today, the title of my sermon is Thorn in the Flesh and Grace of God, based on 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 10. The Lord laid this message about a month ago when I was grading a paper. And I felt, wow, this is an amazing passage that I need to actually share, because it is not only Paul who went through this experience. I myself have been going through this experience. So why not we all just study this? And this will actually give us some kind of principles for us to deal with the thorns that we deal with on a daily basis. Let me just give you a background for 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 to 10. Apostle Paul defends his apostleship from the attacks of his critics by highlighting a few points of boasting. If you look at chapter 11 and 12, he boasts about several things. Let me highlight 4 of them. He boasts about his heritage. In chapter 11, verse 22. And he says like this, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I." So he is boasting about his heritage. Then he boasts about his visions and revelations. From verse 22 onwards, "Are they servants of Christ? I am more." And you can just read more and more. He actually talks about his accomplishments. Let me read some of them. "I have worked much harder, both in prison, more frequently been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods," so on and so forth. And he brags about his accomplishments. And then he talks about the visions and revelations. In chapter 12, he says, "I must go on boasting. Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things." Then he brags about the miracles in verses 11 to 13. Though Apostle Paul has many points to boast about, he does not do so because of 3 things. There is a tendency in Paul and human being in general to become spiritually and morally arrogant. He uses the word arrogant. Let me read verse 7. "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming arrogant," some translations use the word conceited. The meaning of the word arrogant is being too elated or to have an undue sense of one's own self-importance. Yeah, he talks about his heritage. He talks about his accomplishments. He talks about the visions and spiritual experiences. He talks about the miracles he went through. Naturally, there is a tendency in Paul and human being in general to be too elated or to show too much of self-importance. So he's saying, I don't want to boast about these things because I have a tendency to become arrogant, conceited. The second reason is God does not want him to become arrogant, so that the story of Paul was not involved is not at all about him, but it is all about God. So God wanted to protect Paul from becoming self-elated or to become conceited and arrogant, God does something. He doesn't want his servant, Apostle Paul, becoming too arrogant. Then God has placed in him a thorn in the flesh. Sometimes we may think why we need to have thorn in the flesh. Apostle Paul is a very important person next to Jesus. Although there were other apostles, Apostle Paul was more important. In other words, he traveled around, he planted churches, he wrote many documents which later on became scripture. Did Apostle Paul have a thorn in the flesh? It is not fair. But he says, I have a tendency to become arrogant, and God doesn't want me to become arrogant. Otherwise, the path that I have treaded so far, I will not talk about God, I will only talk about myself. Therefore, God has placed in Apostle Paul a thorn in the flesh. The expression thorn in the flesh is a metaphor that most likely came from a Bible passage in the Old Testament, Numbers 33:55. Now we use this expression probably from the scripture, but this is what Numbers 33:55 saying. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall be as barbs. Barbs in the sense, something that is sticky in your eyes, and thorns on the sides, just poking all the time. And they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell. So Paul most likely got this expression or this metaphor from Numbers 33:55. What does it mean? It could mean a simple thorn that we all get when we walk without sandal in one's own body that is physical, that may be easily removed. All you need is you need a safety pin, or you go to a doctor and they just remove the thorn. You're all right. But Paul does not mean a physical thorn that just went in, or a barb that is sticking in his flesh. It could also mean a disadvantage that limits one's ability to freely move, that causes continuous discomfort. Most likely, that is what Paul has in his mind. Some kind of discomfort that was protecting him from becoming arrogant, or causing some kind of discomfort. And in grammar, if you see, it is called dative of disadvantage. There was a disadvantage in his life. Every time he tended to brag about heritage, accomplishments, miracles, the visions, and something was really pulling him back, keeping him on the track, so that he would not talk about himself, rather he would talk about God. It's amazing. The word torment in verse 7, he says here, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. What is this word torment? It signifies an ongoing, debilitating discomfort. A kind of discomfort. It did not happen just 10 years ago. Probably it happened 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and continues to happen even today. It is a debilitating discomfort. It was God who gave it to him. It is not Satan who just came in. It is like the story of Job. Job was tried by Satan, but God gave him permission. There is something we have talked about called divine passive. Here it is saying, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given. Who gave him? We need to have an agency. The agency is God. I was given by God a thorn in the flesh. It was God who gave the thorn to Apostle Paul so that he would not become arrogant, to have an undue sense of one's self-image. Oh, I preached in Achaia. I preached in Macedonia. Oh, I preached in entire Asia Minor. Oh, I have been an amazing church planter in Rome and Corinth. You think of all these people who went around, instead of just beating his chest around and getting credit for himself, this thorn was actually keeping him in right track. And there was a discomfort. A lot of scholars talk about this discomfort, and some people talk about his eye illness, probably some kind of eye illness. Some people thought he had depression. Some people thought he had some weaknesses. And some people even go to the extent of saying, oh, sexual weaknesses. But if you look at the context, most likely the tormentors, the people who opposed his message, always told him, hey, he is not an apostle. He was not with Jesus. See, Apostle Peter, Apostle James, and John, most likely that one, or there may be something else. But this was constantly tormenting him. It was causing him some kind of discomfort in his life. So, because of his heritage, accomplishments, and spiritual experience, Paul might tend to exalt himself or become arrogant or prideful. That is why the thorn was given to him. It is God's pastoral care. Although it was uncomfortable for a man like Apostle Paul, traveling around, sacrificing his life for the gospel, beaten so badly, and is slandered so badly, not accepted by everyone, but God, instead of removing it and helping him to move freely, he chose to keep the thorn in his flesh so that he would not become prideful and he will always think about God. Instead of talking about himself, he would talk about God. It will also protect the Corinthians from placing Paul on a high pedestal. People in Corinth would not say, hey, the church was continually sustained by Apostle Paul. Or people like Lydia, people like Jason, people like Aquila and Priscilla, they would not make Paul a demigod. So God put this thorn in the flesh so that the believers would be protected from placing Apostle Paul on high pedestal. We read that in chapter 12, verse 6. It says, I refrain so no one will think more of me than is warranted. It's beautiful. God's scheme is amazing. In verse 8, he says, 3 times I pleaded. 3 times, probably a complete number, he must have prayed to God. God, remove this thorn, because it is causing discomfort. I'm not able to move freely. But God did not answer. Instead, he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So let's just look at the 2 conclusions about thorn in the flesh. For Paul, living with thorn was not a pleasurable experience. Just like the case of Job, the thorn was inherently evil because he calls it messenger of Satan. When I played soccer when I was small, I would not use my shoes, so I would have a lot of thorns inside, and it is not pleasurable. It's a kind of evil. You have nagging pain until you remove it. One of my brothers met with an accident in 1982, and his leg got smashed, and doctors removed almost entire the debris. But they got somehow a small piece was left behind. For 1 whole year, he was in pain. They had to give him morphine every day for him to sleep, because anytime he moved, even a slightest movement, it would cause pain. Finally, another doctor came and he touched this debris came out. And after that, there was no need for morphine. It came out. It is not pleasurable, thorn in the flesh. We'll talk about what these thorns are for some of us, maybe a little bit later. For Paul, living with the thorn was not a pleasurable experience. The thorn was used to buffet Paul, and it was a constant cause of pain and embarrassment. However, there was a positive side to the thorn. It prevented from Paul becoming arrogant. And he could have become easily arrogant. You know, sometimes some of the people look at me and they say, Pastor, you are a good preacher. And I go to my class and they say, Sir, you are an amazing teacher. I go to my friends, they say, oh, you are a good mentor. And, you know, some people almost come to a place of looking up to me as a demigod. But time and time again, to my wife, to my family members, to my friends, I have shown my ugly side. You know, some of the things that just, you know, all the good things about me just come down. You know, a lot of time I used to feel ugly after that. Did I do that? Did I speak that? How many times I promised to God, God, I would not use those words to my wife or to my children or to my colleagues, but again I have used it. It feels ugly. That's why I said, what I'm going to speak today is about me. In the sense, identifying with Paul. God has placed a thorn in many people. And Apostle Paul, if there is no thorn in your life, I'm so happy. But there are people who can actually boast and beat their chests and be self-elated, become prideful, conceited, arrogant, take the glory away from God, and they become, animals around. They just validate their life with their life. You should be like me. You should pray like me. You should preach like me. You should go around and lead like me. You should be loving like me. And they become the center of their life. A lot of time, that self-elated feeling comes down and we suddenly are broken and say, God, I may be a good preacher, I may be a good teacher, I may be a good mentor, but not without you, God. If I have done anything, it is you. It is you, God. So thorn in the flesh has a positive side of it. The positive side is to keep us on the track. And it is God's pastoral care. God has a way of caring for us, and this could be one of them. And I have been counseling and helping many, many people, and this is one of them. And people struggle with their thorns. Paul's take on the thorn. How does he take this thorn in the flesh, this metaphor, or this life experience? I call it a theology of thorn. We have theology of God, theology of Christ, theology of church, several things. How about a theology of thorn in the flesh? I have several points here. Paul asked to remove the thorn from his life. Verse 8, we read it. 3 times I pleaded. Instead of removing the thorn, God chose to let Paul live with it. Is God unfair? No, God is so pastoral. Instead of removing it, he said, you live with it, Paul. Paul views his thorn from the perspective of God's grace. He is not complaining now. He complained probably 3 times and God said, God, it is so debilitating. It is not able to, and I'm not able to move around freely. It is poking me. It is just, bringing me down all the time. And God said, my grace is sufficient for you. And Paul learned to look at his thorn from God's perspective or God's grace. That is, God not only allowed it, but also helps him or helped him in his pain. If God has allowed the pain, And God will help us and help you to manage the pain. And God, oftentimes benefits from various angles. Keep us down on the track and lets us go through discipleship by being broken, always looking to the cross. Continuous need for Him. Paul's painful, negative situation became a platform for God to demonstrate His power. For him, it was a thorn. For him, it was uncomfortable. And for him, it was not helping him to move. But for God, it is a platform to demonstrate His power. Let me read here. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul now has developed a theology of thorn in the flesh, and he says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest in me. Beautiful. Paul's painful, negative situation became a platform for God to demonstrate His power. The thorn humbled Paul. In verse 9 he says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest in me. Which is better, my accomplishments, my experiences, the miracles that I did, or all the work that I accomplished, or the grace of God that becomes available to me so much every day? For Paul, I would rather go for the grace of God than bragging about my accomplishments. Instead of always saying, I will be able to say, God, God, God. As much as Paul acknowledged his own pain, so much he acknowledged God's grace. He is not actually covering it up. He's openly saying, a thorn in the flesh is given to me. And it is not pleasurable. It's painful. It's poking me so much. It is bringing myself down. To a man like Paul, a man who was an accomplished person, educated man, an influential guy, for him to come here in this way is an amazing model for all of us. He acknowledged his pain, but at the same time, he acknowledged God's grace. Despite the continued presence of the thorn, Paul could continue to carry on God's work. This is a great lesson. In other words, he learned to live with it. He is not really complaining about it. This is the only place he is complaining about it. Instead, he says, whenever I have this weakness, this thorn in the flesh is, bringing pain in me, I can experience God's grace in a very, very special way. I would go for it. Despite the continued presence of the thorn, Paul continued to carry on his work for the Lord. His determination to serve God with his time, talent, and resources did not diminish, it did not come down, and he was not giving excuses. God, I have this, I have that. If we go with the original assumption, he had problem with his eyes, or he had depression, therefore I will not go. God, you did not heal me, therefore I am not going to serve you. For him, the more he acknowledged his pain, he acknowledged God's grace a lot more, because Christian life is all about God's grace, and it is not our accomplishments that we live by, it is God's accomplishment we live by. In other words, a thorn ceased to be his focus, but God's grace became his focus.